Good afternoon. I'm Stephen Johnson, author of a number of books, including Where Good Ideas Come From, and co-creator and host of a new TV series that is coming out in the US and the UK, and coming soon, I believe, to Brazil, called How We Got to Now, which is basically a series about the history of innovation. And I'm here today to kind of end this part of the session to kind of take a step back and think about the themes that have been addressed all morning long about really new ideas and new opportunities and new platforms. How we take the products we make and share them in all the exciting new ways that we have thanks to the digital revolution, thanks to the social media revolution, thanks to the internet and the PC and the mobile ecosystems that surround us. So what I've been doing for the last 10 years or so of my life is thinking about environments and platforms, organizations and people, individuals, who have been unusually innovative in their careers, who've had the ability to come up with unique ideas that have changed the world. And I've written about these ideas. We've now made this TV series about these ideas. And what I've tried to do is to look at not just the technology world, but to look at other spaces as well, to look at the history of science, to look at the history of consumer goods, to look at the history of the creative arts, and to look at technology. And see if there are recurring patterns that we can learn from in these environments and these individuals. How do we make ourselves more creative at work? How do we make ourselves more creative as individuals in the first place? And over all this research and all the kind of different places that I've gone and stories that I've kind of uncovered, I've come up with a series of patterns, kind of recurring attributes of these people and teams and networks. And what I'd like to do today to kind of close out the session is talk about some of these patterns and tell you a few stories of breakthrough innovation from the past and from the present. The first pattern I want to talk to you about this morning is what I call the slow hunch. Now, for some reason, when we think about innovation, we have this almost innate tendency to think about it in terms of light bulb moments, right? Sudden moments of clarity where you have a breakthrough idea. Think of all the metaphors we have to describe good ideas. We have eureka moments and epiphanies and light bulb moments and aha moments, right? There's something about talking about new ideas that makes us want to talk about it in terms of sudden flashes of inspiration, right? The apple falls from the tree and, whoa, we've got a theory of gravity, right? We like to hear the story told that way. But if you go back and study the history of breakthrough ideas, disruptive ideas, as we say now, what you find is the eureka moment is almost always a myth. It's something that we've kind of conjured up after the fact to make the story more compelling. But in fact, the idea almost always took a very long time to develop. It doesn't just flash into our heads in fully realized form. It starts as a hunch, as a feeling that there's something interesting, there's a new opportunity with this product to do something new, or there's a new way of interpreting the world, or a new scientific idea. And it stays in that hunch state for months, sometimes for years, in some cases for decades, before it crystallizes into something that's truly useful. And so it's people and organizations that have the ability to keep these slow hunches alive that end up being the most important innovators. People who chase after the eureka moments almost always end up not being successful. And there are a million examples I could give of this, but the one that I think is particularly relevant to this conversation about the power of digital platforms is here, embedded in this image here. This is a pretty tech-savvy crowd, so some of you can probably figure out what this is. It says, the handwriting says, "This machine is a server. Do not power it down." And the giveaway is that it says CERN there in the upper left-hand corner, which of course is the Swiss physics lab where more than 20 years ago Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web. This little sticker was on the original World Wide Web server back when the entire web was running on one machine, right? So you could literally trip over the power cord and the entire web would go down. Fortunately for us and for Google, that can't happen anymore. There's a lot more redundancy in it, but I love the idea of someone doing that and be like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, you should totally plug that back in. I feel really bad. I took the web down. So the story of how Tim Berners-Lee came about to come up with this, arguably the most important innovation with the internet of the last 40 years, the story of this is a classic case of the slow hunch at work. So he shows up as a young programmer at CERN in the early 1980s, and he's almost instantly overwhelmed by the sheer kind of intellectual intensity of this amazing research lab. I mean, it's a little bit like going to work at Google, as I would imagine it would be. There are all these amazing projects going on and papers being published, and so he decides to create a little application just as a side project for his own personal use, as really as a hobby, to keep track of all these people and papers and projects that are flowing around him at his new job. And so he creates a little application. It's funny, he calls it Inquire. This is a little bit of trivia here for you. When he was a kid in England, he used to read this old Victorian kind of encyclopedia, which had this great Victorian name. It was called Inquire Within Upon Everything, which actually would have been a good name for Google, right? So he ends up remembering this little thing, and he calls his application Inquire. And he uses it for 2 years. He actually, enters in people's names and the paper they just publish, and he kind of has rudimentary links connecting things. And then he kind of forgets about it and moves on. And in the mid-'80s, he picks up the project again, and he starts working on it. He gives it a new name, Tangle. The World Wide Web was almost called Tangle, another bit of trivia. And he actually doesn't build any working code for that. He just kind of sketches it out in his head a little bit. And it's not until the late 80s, a full 5 years after he'd started tinkering with this idea, that he begins to work in earnest on a project that he now calls the World Wide Web. And it eventually leads to this amazing moment as it kind of matures and develops, where he has to go into his supervisors. This is one of the great moments in the history of office politics, where he has to go into his supervisors and say, I believe I may have invented a global communications medium in my spare time. Can this be my day job now? I think I should focus on this rather than the stupid other stuff you have me doing. And fortunately, they said yes, and the rest is history, right? But what's important here is that he was able to keep this project going over this long period of time. And most of us, it's hard to do that, right? We get distracted by the short-term deliverables, the thing that has to get out the door, the project that needs to be finished. And keeping those hunches alive while they mature is tricky. And in fact, it's interesting to be talking about this at Google. Google, is one of the companies that has a kind of famous process called innovation time off, or 20% time, where some employees get to spend some of their time working on kind of side projects that are very much like what Tim Berners-Lee was working on. And that's a system that organizations can use inside their own teams to say, listen, work on what you have to do, and all the things that are deliverable this week or this month or this quarter. But keep those hunches alive as well, and carve out some time each week to work on the thing you're not quite sure about. Because it's very hard to go into your boss and say, I have an idea for something that could be really great for the company, but I'm not sure what it is, and I'm not sure I'll know what it is for another 3 years, right? That's a hard sales pitch to make, right? But if you recognize as an organization that those are going to be the seeds of the most important ideas, you can, I think, get a lot of mileage out of it. So the importance of the slow hunch is really a great place to start in thinking about innovation. But the problem with truly new ideas, truly radical ideas, is, particularly if you're working on them on your own, that you sometimes end up with missing pieces or blind spots, places where you've figured out half the problem, but you've missed something obvious because the idea is so new. It's hard to see the whole thing. I mean, Tim Berners-Lee, you think about the power of this platform, and I'll come back to platforms further along in the talk, but he was really just building this academic tool to share papers and make citations between academic papers and authors, right? He had no idea of the extraordinary amount of use that the World Wide Web would eventually be put to. So there were lots of blind spots in his vision of the thing he was inventing himself. But there are other cases in history where the blind spots have been even more embarrassing. This is one of my favorite stories from the TV show. It's a story about the invention of recorded audio. Now, most of you probably have in your head, you think, okay, recording audio, recording sound waves. I know that story. Thomas Edison invented the phonograph, in the kind of late 1870s. This is a pretty famous story. But in fact, the first actual patent for a device, a machine that would take in sound waves and record them for posterity, was actually registered to a French inventor, the great name Edward Scott de Lyon de Martinville, who invented this device. He called it the phonautograph in 1855, a full 20 years before Thomas Edison's phonograph. He had a patent awarded for this device that actually recorded sound waves. If you're almost a generation ahead of Thomas Edison, you know you're doing something right. I mean, this is an amazing thing. So why has none of us heard of this guy? Right? He comes up with this extraordinary machine. It takes in sound waves, causes a little parchment to kind of vibrate, and it then kind of goes all the way down. The vibrations go all the way down to this little kind of pig bristle, which etches the image of the sound wave into a cylinder that's rotating. I mean, it's this really ingenious device, state-of-the-art sound technology, 20 years ahead of Edison. But we haven't heard of this guy because in coming up with all these brilliant ideas, he forgot to include one feature: playback. There was no way to hear the audio that you were recording. So you could write these sound waves, but that's all you could do. You could just look at the sound waves. You couldn't actually hear them, right? So, there's a reason when, they invented the iPod that they put a headphone jack on there. It wasn't like you have 1,000 songs in your pocket. They just stay there in your pocket. You can't listen to them, right? That would have been a bad product, right? So this guy, this French inventor, comes up with this incredible thing, solves 90% of the problems, but forgets to include the thing that would revolutionize audio and sound 20 years later with the phonograph and Thomas Edison. And what I find so amazing about this story is that it's not like he was trying to add that feature but failed. It never even occurred to him. It was fully in his kind of conceptual blind spot. He thought that if you could figure out a way to write waveforms onto some recording medium, that people would learn how to read those waveforms. And so you could basically, it would be a kind of stenography. You would dictate a letter, and you would take the sound of your voice, write them onto this little piece, and then people would learn how to read these little scribbles and turn them into words. And so instead of actually talking to someone who would transcribe what you were saying, you'd be able to automatically transcribe what you were saying. And ironically, it wasn't a bad bet, right? Human beings have long proved to be very good at translating little scribbles on a page into words and meaning and images. So it was a pretty reasonable thing to think that we would actually be able to learn how to read sound waves and translate those back into language. Unfortunately, turns out human beings do not possess that ability. It's not part of our kind of neurological makeup to do that. No one can do that to this day. So he was a good bet, but if he just thought about then taking that extra step and actually translating it back so that you could take this cylinder and then play it, as Edison hit upon 20 years later, that was the missing piece of this innovation. So this is the kind of the curse of being at the cutting edge, right? You can come up with 90% of the idea, but if you're missing that one, if there's that one key ingredient in your blind spot, you'll be forgotten to history. You'll need people like me to come and find you and talk about you again 150 years later. So the question is, if you are keeping these, developing these hunches and you have these blind spots that are kind of threatening the idea or the ultimate kind of culmination of the idea, how do you get around them? One thing is to go back and take inventory of your past blind spots. Think about that in your own life or your organization's life. Think back over the history of the ideas that you've had or that your team has had. What are the things that you missed that seemed so obvious to you now that were completely blocked off to your kind of field of vision or your ability to forecast the future 5 years ago or 10 years ago? Take inventory of those past blind spots and try and learn from them, right? Because learning about what you failed to see in the past can actually be very predictive about what you're not seeing right now. But the other thing that can be incredibly helpful here is to put yourself in a network of collaborators, and ideally a diverse network of collaborators, because the thing you're not seeing, somebody else might very well see. And throughout history, we've seen these kind of diverse improvisational networks have been huge drivers of innovation. And in Where Good Ideas Come From, I call these liquid networks. They're environments where there's a certain kind of fluidity to the way that ideas are kind of developed and shared. Economists have a great metaphor for this that also uses the liquid metaphor. They call it information spillover. Right? Environments where people get crowded together, and ideas just have a natural tendency to flow from mind to mind. This is what a great city like São Paulo has. You get all these people together, and everyone's so crowded together that they end up sharing their ideas and building on those ideas and filling in each other's blind spots and coming up with new solutions to problems that the individual wouldn't have solved on their own. This is why cities have historically been huge drivers of innovation. The bigger the city, generally, they have a disproportionate amount of innovation inside of the city. So these kinds of networks are very powerful, and I've written about, and in the show we discussed a lot of these networks, but my favorite one really, I think, of all time is the 18th century coffee house. This was, if you had to figure out where the Enlightenment happened, that great flowering of intellectual, scientific, creative ideas in the middle of the 18th century, if you had to figure out what physical space supported and engendered the Enlightenment, you would be wrong to point to a corporate headquarters or a university lecture hall, neither of which fully existed the way they do today. The real seat of the Enlightenment throughout Europe and partially in the United States was the coffee house. The coffee house was where ideas emerged, where new ideas were supported and cultivated, where ideas went from hunches to world-transforming ideas in politics and in science and in business. There are so many examples of this, but one of them, Lloyd's of London, the insurance giant, was originally Lloyd's Coffee House. It was a place where the local ship captains and the investment community and the merchants would get together, and they would talk about all the various issues in their trade and drink coffee. And over time, as their conversation developed, they started to think that maybe there was a way to take this enormously risky but very lucrative business of sending ships all around the world to places like Brazil and take some of the risk out of that process. And through those coffee house conversations, the modern insurance business was born. Ben Franklin, the great American innovator, lived in London for many, many years, and he used to hang out at a place called the London Coffee House with a group of people, and they would gather and have these great open-ended conversations, again, about politics and chemistry and electricity and all these new ideas. And it was an incredible generator of new thinking, this coffee house culture. In fact, when I was researching this book, I was in London, and I wanted to go back and see if there was a plaque on where this coffee house was. It was called the London Coffee House, and it was right near St. Paul's Cathedral. And so I went back looking to see, because if you've been to London, you know there's a plaque on every other building, right? You know, everything is like, the Duchess of so-and-so slept here 13 years ago. And so I found out exactly where this coffee house was, and there's no record of it at all, but I swear to God, there was a Starbucks exactly where this coffee house was. They have no idea, but they're kind of keeping the torch alive for this historic space. So the question is, what was it about the coffee house that made it such a driver of new ideas? And there are two answers to this question, one of which is somewhat tangential, but since we're in Brazil, I should talk about it because it really revolves around coffee. One of the key things here in driving the new ideas in the Enlightenment is the simple fact that people were drinking coffee and tea for the first time in Europe. So you had, up until coffee and tea became affordable parts of people's diets in places like London, which is around 1700, 1710. Until that point, people just drank alcohol all day long. That was the default beverage of choice for the entire population. People would get up and drink beer for breakfast. They would drink beer through the morning at work. They would drink a little wine with lunch. There were these huge gin outbreaks in the 1600s where people just went insane drinking too much gin. And ironically, this was the healthy choice because the water wasn't safe to drink, and they didn't really have an alternative. So they would sit there and be like, well, I would like to have some orange juice with my breakfast, but unfortunately I must have this beer because it's England and it's 1650 and we don't have orange juice, right? So the historians don't talk about this enough, but the reality is people were just drunk all day long in Europe through all this period, and then all of a sudden, this magical substance shows up, coffee and tea, and all of a sudden they're drinking caffeinated beverages for the first time. And the entire culture, in the space of about 40, 50 years, switches from drinking a depressant all day long to drinking a stimulant. And it's no surprise that there's this great flowering of intellectual and scientific and industrial activity. There's new drugs are circulating through the bloodstreams of Europeans. And so there's this dramatic change in the culture. And there's been a lot of scholarship written about this. It sounds almost like a joke, but imagine what it would be like for you if you drank beer for breakfast every morning, and then you switched over to coffee. You would be a little more productive and innovative on the job, I think. I think there's no denying that. For those of you who do drink beer at breakfast, you might think about switching over. I'm just saying, gently suggesting. So coffee was part of the story. The bean itself was part of the story. Caffeine was part of the story. But the real point that's important for us today is that this was a multidisciplinary space, right? This was a space that was not defined by a single product division. It was not defined by a single university field. It was a space defined by an eclectic mix of interests and professions. And people would get together and allow those different interests and passions and hobbies to kind of collide and make new connections in that kind of liquid network form. And that so often is the key to innovation. I'm seeing more and more organizations in the way that they think about the physical layout of their offices try and build new spaces that look much more like these coffee houses. I'm seeing this, I don't know if you all have seen this, but I've seen a lot of what I sometimes call the war on the conference room, where people have decided that conference rooms are where ideas go to die. Right? People schedule a meeting, like a 2 o'clock meeting, they get in the conference room, they close the door, somebody puts up the Q4 projections on a PowerPoint, and everybody like turns off their brain and goes to sleep, right? And so people are taking out whole banks of conference rooms and creating these more coffee, maybe not as chaotic looking as that one, but creating these kind of open-ended coffee spaces where more than one meeting are happening at the same time, where it's curated with interesting art, where there's interesting like packaging designs of products from around the world, that changes every month. So you go into this space and you're encouraged by the architecture alone to make interesting new connections, to collide with somebody, to be having one meeting and say, hey, Bob, wait, you need to be here. We need to talk to you because you could be really useful for this. So sometimes it's the physical arrangement of your workspace that can be the key to kind of having that new idea or changing the way things work or coming up with the hunch that someone else will help complete. And what this does is, I think it changes our understanding of the value of diversity when we think about innovation, when we think about our workspaces. This is a kind of a different argument for diversity. This is not the political argument for diversity. This is not the multicultural argument for diversity in the sense that we want to have diverse teams and workforces so that we will be more tolerant as a society or as an organization. That's a great argument, and it's an important one, and it's been made. This is a different argument. This is an argument that says if we surround ourselves with people who are different from us, we will be smarter. We will have better ideas. We will be more creative in the products we create, in the marketing campaigns we dream up for those campaigns, for those products, and the ways that we use the internet to sell those products. There's a great study a number of years ago by a Stanford business professor named Martin Roif, who was interested in the kind of social networks of unusually innovative people. And he went out, sadly this was before the rise of big social networks, so it was something he had to do by hand. Now he could do it with an algorithm. But he went out and he interviewed two groups of people who had been very creative and innovative in their careers, and then people, to put it gently, who had been less creative and innovative in their careers. If they call you up to ask you to be on that part of the experiment, if they're like, you seem very dull, could we ask you about your friends? Just, hang up the phone, don't answer it. So he analyzed the social networks of these two groups, the innovators and the less innovative group. And when he crunched, kind of all the relationships, what he found was that there was this very distinct pattern on the side of the innovators, which is that the innovators were much more likely to have a much more diverse set of professions in their friend networks. So, one person on the innovative side might work in an ad agency that, kind of sold consumer products, and but that person would be friends with an architect and a popular science writer and a poet and a government contract lawyer. Whereas on the less innovative side, the person would just know other people in advertising. And you can understand from everything I've said up to now why that makes sense, right? It's that casual conversation over coffee with your friend who's the architect. You seem to be doing two different things. You're selling detergent, they're building buildings, but there's something in the conversation about the way they manage their clients in building their buildings that somehow resonates with the way you have to manage your clients. And it ends up triggering this new idea. And in a sense, the idea from one field gets kind of borrowed and ported over into a new context. And in crossing that disciplinary line by migrating over into a new field, something new happens, a new connection forms. On some level, every new idea is a network of older ideas. Right? Every idea, no idea comes into the world fully realized on its own, right? Every idea is a mix of ideas. You take a little bit from here, a little bit from here, a little bit from here. And that's why surrounding yourselves with a kind of a diverse network of people is one of the best ways to create more creative ideas in your own brain, because you've got a richer set of kind of building blocks that you can draw upon to build that new networked idea. And in a way, it's never been easier to do this because we live in an age of these incredible digital platforms that are connecting us in all these extraordinary ways. It's never been easier to find people who are completely different from you if you seek them out. But you have to make that choice. You can't fall into the pattern of just flocking around with people who are exactly like you. You have to look outside your immediate network to find new forms of inspiration. But the digital platforms that surround us now are brilliant for making those, diverse liquid networks possible. And one of the best ways to do that is to learn from your customers. Your customers are this incredible source of diversity, right? They're taking your products and doing things with them that, are going to surprise you. They've got new uses or new ways of selling them or thinking about them, right? There's an incredible source of kind of creativity in the end user. This is what we sometimes call end user innovation. And this is something that the internet and the digital platform has made easier and easier. It's easier and easier to be in touch with those users, to see what they're doing, to learn from them, and in a sense, innovate from the bottom up. Don't just sit around in a kind of R&D lab somewhere and try and come up, put 4 interesting people together and lock them in a room and hope they come up with a great idea. Look at thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people who are taking your products out into the world and experimenting with them and tinkering them and doing interesting things. I mean, you can see this in the history of something like Twitter. Twitter's been wonderful at kind of learning from its users. I love this. This is a protester in Spain from the kind of protest movements a while ago that went by the name of the Spanish Revolution. And I love this sign because this is a classic, like, European. He's in a Madrid, town square. He's got a cardboard hand-lettered sign, a crazy mask, but he's got a hashtag on his sign, right? This is what happens in the age of digital media, right? People put hashtags on their hand-lettered signs. And hashtags have been hugely important in political movements around the world. Occupy Wall Street began as a hashtag. It was a hashtag for 3 months before anybody decided to actually occupy Wall Street, right? Hashtags have been used in, everything from Arab Spring to Spanish Revolution to Occupy. But what I love about this story, talk about innovation from the ground up. If you could travel back in time and meet with the Twitter founders in like 2006 as they're sitting there in San Francisco dreaming up this new service, and you could go in there and say, hey guys, I've got great news. In 4 or 5 years, people all around the world are going to use Twitter hashtags, not just to kind of sell their products and coordinate viewing activities for the Super Bowl, but also to incite political revolutions all around the world. Do you know what the Twitter founders would have said? They would have said, what is a hashtag? Because hashtags were not part of Twitter's service at all. Ev Williams, Jack Dorsey, Fizz Stone, they came up with a lot of great things, 140 character limits, which they borrowed from SMS, the follower architecture, lots of great ideas. Hashtags came from the users. Users started spontaneously to organize tweets and, by using these hashtags, which was an older kind of internet convention. And for a long time, the Twitter guys ignored it until finally they said, geez, everybody's doing this. And so they officially made it part of the service. And now you see, kind of prioritized hashtags. It's a big part of advertising, as you all know. And it's probably one of the single biggest, kind of keystones of their business model, their advertising model is hashtags. And it was invented entirely by their users. That's the ultimate kind of diverse network there. And the beautiful thing about it is you don't have to pay them a cent, right? It's all this free creative labor that people want to contribute. They want to make the products better, right? They love the idea that they helped do something, or they helped come up with a new campaign for something, or they helped come up with a new use for a product, and they shared it, and you went with it, right? They like being involved. That creates an incredible sense of kind of collective ownership here, that we're all developing these products and these ideas. So these kinds of platforms, we're going to see more and more of this. This is really the future, and in a sense, what it means is that the kind of the membrane, the dividing line between people who work for the company and the people who use the products the company makes, that line is blurring, and there's going to be more dialogue and more collaboration across those lines, as these technologies develop and as our kind of appetites for these things develop. So those are a few of the kind of the patterns that I've talked about, written about, that I think are important to us today. But I want to leave you with kind of one last story that I think brings a lot of these things together, and that's increasingly important in thinking about how we organize our kind of shopping experiences and how we advertise. We heard the word hyperlocal mentioned in the last talk. And this is a story that begins in October of 1957. That's a great story of innovation and the way innovation takes us in unpredictable ways, in directions. October 1957 is the time when the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first man-made satellite to orbit the planet. And in the United States, this was seen as a very transformative moment. People were kind of freaked out about it. And there was a lab in Johns Hopkins, a little bit quite like CERN, a kind of advanced physics lab, though focused a little bit more on military technologies. And in that lab, the Monday after the announcement of Sputnik's launch, there's a bunch of people hanging out at kind of the liquid network of the lab. It was called the APL. And they're hanging out, talking about this momentous event. The Soviets launched this thing. How did they do it? What does it mean? And they're two young kids. They're two 25-year-old PhD students named Geyer and Weifenbach. And they're hanging out, talking to some of their older colleagues. And they're talking about how they did it and what's going on. And then all of a sudden, one of these kids says, hey, has anybody tried to listen for this thing? It's got to be sending some kind of signal out. We should be able to track it. And the older colleagues are like, that's a good idea, kid. You should try and do that. And so they go back to their lab, and it turns out one of them is kind of an expert in microwave reception, and he's got a little antenna and a little amplifier set up. And so they start kind of listening for any signal coming from this satellite. And it turns out the Soviets have made Sputnik so that it sends out a very clear kind of ping very regularly, so that basically people would know it was not a hoax. They were afraid people would think they were just making it up. And so within a couple of hours, these kids have heard this satellite from orbit, and this is amazing. It's just this little beep, but it's the most beautiful music they've ever heard in their lives. They're listening on these headphones, and people come into the office, and they're putting the headphones on and being like, that's amazing. Now, they're doing this, no point to this at all. There's no objective here. This is just a hunch. It's just a feeling that there's something interesting and worth doing, just for the heck of it. And then they start thinking, well, we should record this. This is history. And so they get a big reel-to-reel deck, and they start recording it, and they put little timestamps for each ping. And then they start noticing that there's slight frequency variations between each of the pings. They change a little bit over time. And they realize, geez, I think we could use the Doppler effect to figure out actually how this thing is moving and causing these frequency variations as it's moving through space. And so they go off and they get some advice from some of their colleagues. And then a couple of weeks later, they start thinking, gosh, we could probably figure out the points, given those changes, we could figure out the points at which the satellite is closest to our antenna and the points at which it's farthest away. That would be kind of cool. And so they work on that. They get some time on this like room-sized computer that they had back then to calculate those locations. And by the end of this process, they have figured out the exact location of Sputnik in the sky, based entirely on these little pings from the satellite. No point to this, just a hunch, just a cool little hack to do. But then word leaks out about what they've done, And the guy who runs the APL calls them into his office and says, hey, listen, I want to talk to you guys about your Sputnik thing. So you guys figured out how to figure out the location of an object orbiting the planet if you know your location on the planet. And I'm wondering if you could do it the other way. And they're like, what are you talking about? He's like, well, what if you knew the location of the thing in orbit? Could you figure out your location on the surface of the Earth? And they're like, well, we never thought about that. Let us think about it. They went back and they came back and they said, yes, you could. In fact, it would be slightly easier. And so the APL guy says, well, that's good news, boys. And he kind of ominously shuts the door and says, because we're working on these new nuclear submarines. And it turns out to be very difficult to get your missile to land exactly on Moscow the way you want it to if you don't know exactly where your submarine is in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And so we're thinking we're going to take some of these satellites, throw them up there, and use your magic technique to figure out exactly where our submarines are. And that, if you haven't figured it out already, is the birth of GPS. Right? And you know where this story goes, right? Talk about innovation taking you into new places, talk about the power of platforms, right? Initially, this is what GPS is used for. It's used to keep track of nuclear missiles and nuclear submarines, thankfully never to bomb Moscow. But it gets slowly opened up over time and becomes a platform that all of us can use. And meanwhile, that room-sized computer shrinks down miraculously to something that, is, a million times more powerful and sitting on an Android phone. And over here, Tim Berners-Lee starts inventing this crazy new platform that initially doesn't have anything to do with geography at all. But then people start building maps on that platform, including a company called Google. And people start building other things on top of those maps, and people start building advertising networks that can tie to those maps, and people start listing their products in stores that have geographic coordinates that are coordinated by GPS, with devices walking around that are in our hands that are this size. And all of a sudden, we're using this vast network for a purpose that these kids in 1957 had no idea they were inventing. And all of us contributed to that in small ways. We added this, we added this, we added this. It was this massive kind of global process. But here we are today, and we're using it for all these different applications that no one ever dreamed of. In fact, I guarantee you someone in this room has used all these amazing technologies in the last 24 hours to locate a nearby coffee house, right? This is the kind of stuff that we're doing with this technology. And that is the power of innovation and digital platforms today. This is the best example of it. When you put all these different patterns together, when you allow those slow hunches to mature, when you create diverse networks, you think initially you're trying to just follow this hunch and track down this satellite that you've heard about. Then you think you're fighting the Cold War. And it turns out 50 years later, you're just helping somebody find a soy latte. That is the power of innovation when it's done right. Chance favors the connected mind. Thank you very much.